Ugh. Very annoying. Every time I have to set this studio up, it takes longer. The good news is I have a new laptop, so editing is now going to be a beautiful, breezy joy, and I may even release these in 4K. Probably not, because I don't want to have to edit giant 60 gigabyte files just to get these videos about Animorphs out. They'll probably just be in 1080p, but just know that I could release a 4K video if I wanted to. What is good, guys, and welcome back again. My name is Marcello, and I talk about media with a focus on 90s kids books, at least so far, and in this series I'm conducting a thorough analysis of each of the books in the Animorphs series by K.A. Applegate. This is not all of them, this is just most of them. My collection is not complete. I'm assigning weighted rankings to these books based on the following criteria: plot, significance, character development, and writing, with the ultimate goal of having some sort of master list of which Animorphs book at least I prefer the most, and maybe why. In this episode, we're covering the fourth book in the series, The Message. I think I have it here somewhere. So The Message is the first book narrated by Cassie. I have a separate series on why Cassie may be the most underrated Animorph, and you should totally check that out, but as an FYI, my thoughts and opinions on these books have changed already over the course of this reread, so it's very likely that these will be very distinct videos with very distinct and unique points. Maybe not that unique. So, The Message. This book came out in 1996, and it was written by K.A. herself. Its front cover, by David Mattingly, depicts Cassie morphing into a dolphin. I don't know if it's going to focus on this. I have it set to look for faces, so. The front cover quote is, "Sometimes you have to change a little more than your mind." And the inside cover quote is, "Cassie's acting a little fishy," which is funny because she's morphing dolphin in this book. Our fun fact for this book is that Axe was actually supposed to be introduced in book 2, but Kay decided to delay his entrance to the book when she realized that this series was going to be way longer than she'd originally planned. The book also featured a contest for fans to mail in what animal they wished that they could morph into and why, with 3 winners being picked to have their likenesses morphed into their animals of choice and published within future books. The winners can actually be found in the backs of books 10 and 12, as well as Megamorphs number 1. I did not win this contest, by the way, but I would have morphed a polar bear. By the way, just for fun, if you're watching this and you want a free copy of The Message, comment below what animal you would like to morph to and why, and I will find some type of semi-random way to pick 1 or 2 people, depending on how many extra copies of The Message I have, and I will mail them to you for free! Alright, with no further ado, let's recap and comment on this book. So we open with our usual introduction. My name is Cassie, no last name. If the Yeerks find out who we are or that we're human, it's game over. In case anyone needed the reminder, Cassie's parents run a wildlife rehabilitation center out of her barn. Her dad's a vet and her mom works at the Gardens, which is this zoo amusement park hybrid. This is super useful to the Animorphs in their various missions because they get to acquire animals from the Gardens. In the first scene of this book, Cassie is in the barn preparing to morph into a squirrel in order to find out what animal has been breaking into the barn at night. Cassie mentions that when she morphed into a trout a few books ago, she was constantly thinking about being preyed upon by another animal. This is worthy of note because we didn't really get any of the Animorphs' perspectives of that morph as it took place during a Tobias book. So Cassie morphs this squirrel, and despite attempting to mentally prepare for the onslaught of its prey nature, her human mind is promptly overridden by the squirrel's instincts. Tobias shows up and he tries to eat her, and then a fox appears, solving the mystery of who's been breaking into the barn at night, and the fox is about to eat Cassie too when she's able to muster enough self-control to ask Tobias for help. He promptly chases the fox away. During the ensuing discussion, Cassie describes Tobias to us, saying that Tobias had almost completely accepted the fact that he was permanently stuck in the body of a red-tailed hawk. Recently, he had begun to hunt and eat like a hawk, and he was still a little sensitive about it, but I thought if I just made a joke out of it, he would realize that I wasn't grossed out or anything. This is a nice little summary of Tobias's situation and a great showcase of Cassie's character. It makes sense that Cassie wouldn't judge him for killing to eat. Even though Cassie is the most empathetic of the Animorphs, she does have a pragmatic stripe when it comes to nature. This starts off pretty small, as in the case of her being accepting of animals, killing other animals for food, but it evolves into some fairly large-scale moral relativism towards the middle of the series when Cassie's ripping out Hork-Bajir throats and pondering possible ethical justifications for cross-species subjugation. Interestingly, Cassie sort of becomes more like Marco throughout the series, at least until the final stretch, but we'll get to that later on. Tobias mentions that he's been having these weird dreams about the sea and about a voice calling out to him from beneath the waves, and Cassie gets the chills because she has been having the the exact same dreams. The next day, the gang gathers in Rachel's room. Rachel's got quotes about war and battle pinned up around her room, which makes Cassie sad because in their previous life, it would have just been like motivational, normal teen things. Tobias and Cassie have just told the group about their identical dreams, and Marco is telling them that he hasn't had any weird dreams about the sea. He mentions that he's had weird dreams about a woman on Baywatch, something which was changed in later editions to dreams about a lifeguard at the beach. We get a quick debrief of the group's general dynamic, and Cassie takes care to point out how opposed to the general fight against the Yeerks Marco is. As I was writing the script, it occurred to me that all of the Animorphs have books in which they're contemplating quitting, and that's something I'll be keeping an eye out for as I reread the series this time through. Anyway, we learn that Jake and Cassie like each other, and that Rachel is fearless and pretty. Jake whips out a VHS tape on which he's recorded a news story, which is about the least likely thing I can imagine, even within the context of these books, but we're gonna give it a pass. I bet they rewrote this in future editions. How do you guys feel about books being rewritten or edited for modern audiences, by the way? I have kind of mixed feelings about this. And I'm going off script here, so pardon me if I ramble. I think generally it is up to the artist and needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. I was deeply offended when I found out that they were changing the Roald Dahl books because language is so critical to his books. I mean, his like whimsy, his way with words, the kind of dark humor that is in all of his books is excellent, and it's characteristic of Roald Dahl novels. They're not the same without it. He wouldn't be the author that he is. He wouldn't have risen to the level of popularity that he did if he didn't have such a unique voice. So I feel like watering down his language is like a terrible cardinal sin of literature. In cases like Animorphs, though, it's a little bit different. I think there's a solid argument to be made that these books are made to be a little bit timeless. They're for kids, and we want all kids to be able to read them and to be able to relate to them. And things like dated media references or dated media format references could really pull the reader out of their immersion there. At the end of the day, I think it probably just comes down to the author. I think if an author has died and hasn't left any explicit instructions about updating their books for any type of audience, they should be left well alone, though. Art is really important, and it's not only a reflection of the artist, but it's often a reflection of the time period that it was created in. And I think that it's important to be able to read all of these works and be appreciative of and reflective of how much society has changed since they came out. Having said that, if an author leaves in their will, please keep updating this, which I can only imagine that KA would want to do because she definitely wants these books to be as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. I think it is A-okay and definitely serves a very strong purpose. Anyway, back to the book. So the group all watches this news story in which an old guy is at the beach showing off a piece of metal that he's found. The news camera focuses in on the piece of metal, and the group sees some foreign-looking writing, which Jake says he recognizes from when he was on Elfangor's ship getting the Escafil device. Jake says that he thinks that what this man has is the piece of an Andalite ship, and Cassie faints. When she's unconscious, she hears this disembodied voice calling to her, asking her to come to it if she can hear it. And with that, she wakes up on Rachel's floor, and Tobias, who is also passed out, regains consciousness next to her, and the rest of the group admits that they felt something as well. Together, they deduce that it must be an Andalite calling to them, and Cassie recalls the night that they met Elfangor, alleging that something really deep went on between Tobias and Elfangor, which might be the reason that he also fainted. The group decides to vote on whether or not to help the probable Andalite, with everyone voting in favor, including Marco, who fakes everyone out for a second before emotionally pledging his loyalty to the Andalites. Funny how their perception of the Andalites is going to change throughout these books. In the next scene, the gang is at the beach discussing the logistics and overall wisdom of their plan. They wonder why Tobias and Cassie are the only two to have had these dreams, reasoning that for Cassie, it must be that she has the most talent for morphing, and that for Tobias, being stuck in morph must make him like very susceptible to these Andalite messages. I think they are wrong on both counts here. I think they're confusing cause and effect. Whatever it is that's making Tobias and Cassie feel this way, it is upstream of their respective situations. Tobias's Nothlit status, Cassie's propensity for morphing. She morphs very well because of something else. In Tobias's case, it's obviously a product of his lineage, but for Cassie, I just don't think that her being the best at morphing would make her most susceptible to this message. I think that the same quality that makes her good at morphing has simultaneously led to her being receptive to Axe's message here, and that's the same quality that makes her able to understand animals and having so much empathy for all different species, even alien species later on in the series. Cassie's like this interspecies, like galactic shaman, basically. And that is the quality that makes her able to hear Axe's message. That's also the quality that makes her able to be very good at morphing. That is my point that I've sort of very long-windedly backed into here. So as the group discusses this, they see a group of humans combing the beach in the distance, and this turns out to be the Sharing, a front organization for the Yeerks voluntary host expansion. Tom, Jake's brother, is with them, and Tobias overhears reassures them, and he lets the group know that they've been very worried about the fragment of Andalite ship that the human on the news found. Tobias also hears the controllers mention that Visser 3 has been having visions that make him cranky. After some discussion at the beach, the controllers find the Animorphs' footprints and they start tracking them, and the Animorphs run away, but they're unable to morph lest their tracks betray that they are the Andalite bandits. They get shot at, and they ultimately wind up morphing trout in the ocean, with the caveat that trout are freshwater fish. Why didn't they just wade into the ocean and morph seagulls, by the way? Do they have seagull morphs? They do have seagull morphs by now, right? So as Cassie sinks under the water, she hears Controller Tom ask Controller Chapman if it's possible that the Andalite bandits are not Andalites after all, indicating to the human tracks leading to the water and the subsequent lack of humans in the water as evidence. Chapman laughs and he says it's possible, but he won't be the one to try to tell the Visser. And this, I suppose, explains a lot of why the Animorphs are able to get away with so much. The Visser is extremely narrow-minded, and he's surrounded himself with yes-men, so his ideas are never challenged. He's latched on to the conclusion that because the entities giving him so much trouble can morph, they must be Andalites. I wonder what other things that we as the reader have assumed are like Yeerk logic or Yeerk custom or just an overall failure of the Yeerks as a society are actually just a product of Visser 3's aggressive ineptitude.
What's good, guys? Editor Cello here. I actually thought of another point while I was writing this, which is that this book is really our first introduction to the fact that we've been given a very narrow window into the perception of the different alien races that we've encountered. And I think this book is kind of where we start expanding that window a little bit. Like, we've pretty much just seen a few very specific Yeerks take actions, and I've made some assumptions about the Yeerks broadly because of this that are going to start being disillusioned as we learn more about Yeerk society. I need to read Visser again. I'm looking forward to getting to that point in this series. Same with the Andalites. Like, we got Elfangor, basically, and he acted a certain way, and we kind of applied that to the Andalites more broadly, and now we're learning more because of Axe, but I think ultimately we're also going to make some assumptions about the Andalites because of the way that Axe acts that are then going to be further disillusioned. Yeah, just an interesting point that I thought was worth including in here, so sorry about the bad audio quality. I'm not bringing my microphone upstairs for this.
I know the Visser has his fans, and I'll probably get some comments defending him, which is highly encouraged, but if your subordinates mutually suspect that something critical might be wrong with your approach to a massive problem and are too scared to tell you, then you failed as a leader. That's objectively true, I think. So anyway, the Animorphs morph trout, they have some trouble breathing in the salt water, but ultimately they are able to escape. They don't see each other for a few days, they're taking care of their non-Animorph lives, and a few days later, Jake pays Cassie a visit. They're shoveling manure together when he tells her that the group is waiting for her to tell them what to do about the Andalite ship. She rejects the burden of this decision, recalling all the sacrifices and close calls that have already happened, thinking about Tobias being a Nothlit, but Jake tells her that she should make the call because she's the best morpher, and because they all trust her. And that they would all have her back, except for probably Marco, who would be equally ready to chalk up the visions to fever dreams and go home. Jake helps walk Cassie through the emotional weight of making decisions that may have far-reaching and permanent consequences on your loved ones, not to mention humanity, and Cassie ultimately decides that they should go search for the Andalite. You have to appreciate the care that goes into building their relationship here. This is the first book narrated by Cassie, and she's having a problem that fits right into what we know to be Jake's wheelhouse, not to mention his defining characteristic with respect to the group dynamic in the series as a whole. It's nice to see two characters show us why they work together, rather than just writing it as true and having us believe it. Cassie and Jake's development is fun to watch. Big props to KA here. So after deciding that they'll have to acquire something ocean-friendly to investigate further, Cassie and Jake discuss morphing dolphins, with Cassie offering light moral objection on the grounds of dolphins being highly intelligent. Jake again defers to her judgment and leaves her feeling much less at ease than she'd been prior to his visit. On top of some fun relationship building with Cassie and Jake, this scene actually highlights another important fact, which is that Cassie is already the group's sort of ethics czar. I can't think of a better term right now. I meant to think of one before I read this, but that is what's written. She's not quite their moral compass yet. She's kind of like a consultant who specializes in finding ethical justifications for things or asking the unpleasant questions that the rest of the group would rather avoid. I also find it interesting how in this passage they sort of brush off Tobias having had the exact same experience with the dreams as Cassie. It all has to come down to her, probably for plot and character development purposes. It is kind of silly, though, that Jake just dismisses Tobias's perspective, saying that they'll have to be in the ocean, so Tobias won't be able to help, so Cassie needs to make this decision. So Tobias is still having the visions, he's still an Animorph, so I think he should still have a substantial say in whether they go or not. It should not entirely fall on Cassie's shoulders, and Tobias corroborating the visions, as well as Visser 3, should be more than enough for Marco and the rest of them to accept that these visions are, at least, real and a product of something substantial. The next day, the gang takes a trip to the gardens to try to acquire some dolphins. They achieve this goal without too much trouble, although Cassie shares her moral hang-up with the group over whether or not it's ethical to acquire such an intelligent species. She equates acquiring the dolphins to doing what the Yeerks do, and saying that if the dolphins are too intelligent and sentient, it will basically be like taking over their mind. I find this to be a huge stretch, and I know I was just going on about what a great character Cassie is, in my opinion of her doing a real 180 in recent years, and it has, but this specific moral debate is so tedious. Dolphins are intelligent, sure, but even if they were humans, acquiring and morphing them is not the same as what the Yeerks do. The Animorphs just copy the DNA of the animal they acquire. No one loses anything. It seems like the issue here is that the animals can't consent, but the dolphin intelligence shouldn't necessitate that they require a greater level of consent than any other animal, at least in my view. It's broadly accepted that animals can't consent and that this bars humans from doing certain things with them. So it seems to me like either morphing is included in this bucket or it isn't. The level of intelligence an animal has doesn't really make the violation any less of a violation, if that's what it is. In either case, I do not consider it a violation, so it just feels tedious to me, although I appreciate that KA was writing to her audience and had to take the journey with some of the more sympathetic readers so that they could better enjoy the subsequent adventure. That night, Cassie has the dream again, although the voice is notably fainter. The next day, the gang meets upriver of their ultimate destination in order to avoid crowds and unnecessary risk. Cassie goes first, and she's surprised at the lack of overwhelming dolphin instinct that she feels. The dolphin mind is much more reserved and curious, missing the typical onslaught of instincts that many morphs bring, and for which Cassie was bracing herself. The rest of the Animorphs join her in morph, and they have a great time racing the current down to the ocean. After some time, Tobias interrupts their gallivanting to let them know that while they may believe they're in full control, they have spent about 45 minutes playing around in the water at this point and might want to get on with the mission. The mission, as a reminder, is to look for something, probably a spaceship. The group tries to focus and soon notices a group of sharks attacking a whale. Together they attack the sharks and are able to fend them off, saving the whale's life. But Marco gets his tail bit off in the process and has to do a quick demorph back to human where he's at risk of drowning before the whale that they saved brings them up to the surface like a giant living sea elevator. After the whale saves Marco, Dolphin Cassie communes with the whale and hears his life story. The Animorphs don't go into weird mysticism all the time, but they do sometimes, and it's usually in Cassie books. Cassie's able to talk to the whale, and he tells her about a strange presence in the ocean that they can only assume is the stranded Andalite ship. The next day, Cassie visits Marco, telling us all about how poor Marco is since his dad got all depressed and quit his job. The purpose of her visit is to apologize to him for almost getting him killed, or possibly just to offload her guilt, but Marco cuts her off in either case. In typical pragmatic Marco fashion, he tells her that he didn't die, so she has nothing to complain about or apologize for. He tried his best to live, which was his responsibility, and he survived. She asks if he was scared, and he tells her, frankly, that he is always scared now. They're able to laugh past this thorny part of the conversation, and Marco tells Cassie that he's just seen news that 2 separate diving projects will be taking place near where the Andalite distress call is coming from. They reason that both of these efforts are likely controllers. Cassie's reluctant to do anything at this point in light of what she perceives as the near tragic consequences of her last decision, but Marco talks her back on board, reminding her of Elfangra's sacrifice and telling her that doing nothing when she knows something is wrong is a decision unto itself. Marco leaves, but not before pointing out how funny it is that it's equally likely on this mission that they're killed by like a regular Earth predator like a shark as opposed to Visser 3 and his forces. I really appreciate Marco after reading this passage, although I always appreciate Marco. He's been among my favorite characters forever. He probably would be my #1 character if I weren't such an angst junkie. He's always so rational, but also very observant and perceptive. He's usually aware of the bare facts of a situation, even as he protests the inevitable decision that they will make. He manages to find bandwidth to inject humor at necessary moments to help his friends through tough situations. It's also worth pointing out that we're being set up really nicely for The Predator, the next book in the series, which Marco narrates and in which he's pretty much over the fight, ready to quit the Animorphs, but is pulled back by some unexpected news. Okay, next scene. We are back at Rachel's house. It's a few hours later. The group has decided that they're going to be conducting a more thorough search for the source of the distress beacon, following the directions that the whale gave Cassie. They decide to morph seagulls, sneak aboard a ship, then abandon ship, and morph dolphins when the opportunity arises. Cassie and Jake walk home from this gathering together, and Cassie tells Jake to make sure that Tobias is okay. He may be feeling left out since he can't morph. We got a lot of development of other characters in this book. First Marco, now Tobias. I didn't even include all the specific things that Cassie said said about Tobias in earlier parts of this book. This, again, does a lot to set up their future books, or keep us invested in their stories in Tobias's case, and I think it also demonstrates Cassie's empathy. Cassie and Jake have a cute moment before the chapter ends. The next day, the gang is on their way to the port to find a ship to stow away on. They're in seagull morph, pointing out every somewhat edible piece of garbage that they pass on their journey. I always found this to be a really endearing thing about seagull morph, by the way. They find a suitable ship and they demorph. After about an hour, they're ready to jump off the ship, with the exception of Marco, who actually can't swim. His proposed solution is that he morph halfway, and then the gang push him over the rail of the ship, where he'll finish morphing on his way to the water. This prompts Cassie to freak out, saying that she doesn't want to be responsible for anyone's death, that the plan isn't going to work, before Marco, true to what he told her earlier about being responsible for his own survival, takes some assumed risk and starts morphing dolphin. After pushing his half-morph form over the railing, the rest of the Animorphs jump ship. They're able to successfully morph dolphins, and the imagery of being a lonely human in the middle of the ocean, alone, relatively defenseless, definitively out of one's element, and then changing into something that's completely adapted to this environment was always really cool for me, especially since I do not love the ocean. It's too big, it is scary, the idea of all that water, the multitudes of life contained within, the amount that we don't know about what's down there, I don't like it. I don't like any of it. I'm currently learning to hang glide. I have no problem floating around in the sky with the potential of falling to my death, but you would never catch me doing scuba, not in a million years. Anyway, Cassie taps into her dolphin instincts to try to better decipher the whale's message from earlier. They get closer to the spot where she thinks the Andalite ship may be, and as they approach it, they see a helicopter dragging some kind of cable through the water, indicating that the Yeerk's search is already underway. They take a deep breath and they dive, and aren't on the ocean floor for long before they see it. A giant, transparent dome, a half-mile in diameter, resting on the ocean floor. Inside the dome is something that basically just looks like a park with bluish grass, orange and blue trees, even a lake. They locate an entrance to the structure and find themselves in some type of foyer airlock situation, which quickly drains the room of water while the Animorphs resume their human forms. Once they're back on their feet, they enter the dome and are promptly knocked unconscious by an Andalite with a shredder. An interrogation follows, with the Andalite initially confused that the humans were able to hear his message, and then dismayed as the story unfolds and he hears of Elfangor's death, at which point we learn that this Andalite is Elfangor's younger brother. Upon hearing that the Animorphs are also fighting the Yeerks, the Andalite warms up a bit. He tells the Animorphs that they're standing in the main part of an Andalite dome ship, where most of the crew of an Andalite vessel typically lives. During a great battle above Earth, the Andalite dome ship separated from the dome, something often done before battle, and the Andalite, whom we know is Axe, and whom we learn is basically an Andalite teenager, was left behind. He watched as his ship was destroyed before Dracon Fire damaged the dome portion of the ship, which subsequently fell into one of Earth's oceans. The Andalite begins to tell the Animorphs how he summoned them using something called a mirror wave call, but he stops himself, stating that he shouldn't explain Andalite technology, and that Elfangor would have been angry with him for doing so, which is super ironic, considering that he's standing in front of a bunch of morph-capable humans who got their power from Elfangor. The Andalite finally introduces himself as Aximili Escarouth Isthil, with Marco quickly dubbing him Axe. Axe asks who their prince is, and when the group all turns to Jake, Axe pledges his loyalty to him, at least until he can return to his Andalite cousins. Welcome to the crew, Axeman. It is very cool reading this introduction to Axe and how he first appears to the Animorphs, knowing how his character turns out. In this first appearance, he's definitely got his characteristically placative nature, deferring to authority and rules and seizing the first opportunity to defer decision-making and responsibility to someone else. In this case, his new prince, Jake. However, it's still clear that he considers himself to be in a different league from humans, both from the way he talks to them, his covetous way of discussing Andalite technology even in spite of the circumstances and Elfangor's implied approval, and in the fact that he basically only promises to listen to Jake if there's no Andalite around. It seems like Axe has accepted the bare reality of his situation, but doesn't really respect the Animorphs yet. It'll be fun to watch him grow, first into the goofy but earnest alien sidekick, and then the more self-assured and kind of douchey warrior that he becomes. We'll get there in Axe's story. I think he turns into a little bit of an ass by the end of the series. Knowing all the obstacles Axe's loyalty to Jake will have to endure, it's very cool, again, to witness the moment where his fealty to Prince Jake really begins. So with the initial encounter out of the way, Axe shows the Animorphs around, revealing some things about Andalite culture in the process. He basically conveys them as like alien hippies, which subverts the Animorphs' expectations, given that they've only been exposed to the more martial aspects of Andalite culture so far. Their conversation turns to the the Yeerks, whom Axe clearly viscerally hates. Axe's hatred for the Yeerks is pretty one-dimensional here, and I feel like this was probably intentional, as it serves to demonstrate the effectiveness of military propaganda on a young mind like Axe's. We know that KA doesn't think that the Yeerks are a monolithically evil race, but Axe clearly perceives them this way. Irrespective of their ultimate morality, it does seem to be an undisputed fact that the Yeerk invasions typically leave the victim planets ravaged of flora and fauna, a prospect that is harrowing to Cassie. When Rachel asks how the Yeerks were able to evolve up to this point, Axe says that he is forbidden from sharing that knowledge. As the gang prepares to morph and leave the dome with Axe in tow, Cassie thinks about how now she really knows who she is fighting. What's funny here is that Cassie leaves this encounter with Axe freshly propagandized and ready to do whatever it takes to stop the Yeerks in their tracks, but this clearly doesn't stick given her development in future books. I think it's a testament to her intelligence and autonomy that she's eventually able to come to her own conclusions about the Yeerks, given both her experience with them and Axe, someone with relative authority on the subject, telling her that they are irredeemably evil in every way, and especially in a way that is specifically offensive to Cassie, the fact that they will indiscriminately destroy all forms of nature that are not beneficial to them. As the gang prepares to morph, they learn that Axe has already acquired a sea creature, which is very convenient, but before they're able to ascertain what, a Yeerk boat appears in the distance above them, and they soon hear the ping of sonar. As they hurry through their morphs, the Yeerks begin attacking the dome from the surface, and the Animorphs are barely able to escape as the dome is destroyed around them. To the surprise of the dolphin Animorphs, the sea creature Axe was able to acquire happened to be a shark. Fortunately, this proves useful as Visser 3's blade ship pops up to dump a bunch of taxons into the water to pursue them. Now, taxons can swim, but between Axe's shark and the 5 dolphins, the Animorphs are able to make very quick work of them. Unfortunately, as they're charting course for the nearest island that they can discreetly demorph on, Visser 3 morphs something called a Mardrut, a monster from the oceans of an Andalite moon, and goes after them himself. The chase lasts a while, and when the Visser starts to taunt them, Axe almost loses it. He's never been exposed to Visser 3 directly before, and seems to fear him more than he even hates him. Cassie tries to encourage Axe, but even she can see that they're losing ground consistently, and it will only be a matter of time before the Visser catches and eats or enslaves them. Cassie hears the wail from earlier in the distance, and in a moment of desperation, she attempts to call him for help. The Animorphs turn to make a last stand against the Visser, and Cassie and Jake have a I wanted to tell you moment, pretty much identical to the one that Rachel and Tobias had in the previous book, before they rush to their fate. They're about to collide with the Visser when suddenly another creature beats them to it. A pod of whales has shown up to rescue them. They manage to beat the Visser back, and as he retreats, the humpback whale whom Cassie has been referring to as her whale throughout the book shows up. She thanks him in her own fashion, thinking about how maybe it wasn't just her distress call that summoned him, but some deeper instinct that there was a malignant alien force in his ocean. The Animorphs resume their human forms, and they rest on the whale as he carries them back to shore. There are a lot of things that happen in Animorphs books that are unlikely, that sort of stretch the suspension of disbelief. They're science fiction books. They're like science fiction fantasy books, and they obviously aren't really tethered in reality. Having said that, I think that this is probably the biggest stretch of a plot point that exists in these books. Maybe it's not. Comment down below and let me know what you think. I feel like this is the apex of like sort of almost supernatural mysticism. It isn't though, because the Elemist also, I don't know. Let me know down below. Do you feel like this fits? Do you feel like this is a big stretch that sort of sticks out in the Animorphs books? For me, it always stuck out a little bit as particularly unlikely, but maybe it's not. Maybe there's other stuff that is equally unlikely or equally mystical and shamanistic that I'm just not thinking of right now. I know there's stuff, and I know people are going to comment and point it out to me, and I am happy to read those comments and respond to them. So do it. Do it. As the Animorphs wrap up their journey, Cassie and Jake revisit their earlier discussion about the ethics of morphing dolphins. Jake theorizes that if they could consent, the dolphins would agree to letting the Animorphs use their DNA, since the Animorphs are trying to save them after all. Cassie disagrees, telling him that they wouldn't understand, which they both get a chuckle out of. Cassie is correct here, and I'm glad she speaks up, because they're just not smart enough to understand that we have to use them for the greater good, but if they were, they'd be okay with it, so it's okay is a super slippery slope, ethically speaking. I know that Jake doesn't consider himself as anything close to a philosopher king, but fundamentally being open to the idea that you may not have a complete grasp on the right thing to do in a given circumstance winds up being critical to the Animorphs navigating the war as a whole. He and Cassie do come to the understanding, however, that they will do whatever they have to in order to win. I think the way that they define win is important here, though. Right now, they're probably both thinking about eradicating the Yeerk threat, stomping them into submission, or kicking them back to some far corner of the galaxy where they can't hurt anyone. Do whatever we have to in order to win in this context context means doing some things that are ethically questionable in order to achieve a better final outcome. Things like morphing semi-sentient animals, or lying to their parents, or killing the occasional Yeerk host. These things are going to get bigger and more questionable as the books go on. We're going to see Cassie go down this route for a while until her win conditions suddenly change, at which point do whatever we have to in order to win means less I will forego morality to win this fight, and more I will reset my expectations and understanding of my enemy and my allies in order to stop this fight. My baby's awake. You know, he's not crying, he's gonna stay there. So with the Animorphs back on shore, Tobias is able to reunite with them, voicing his astonishment that they've returned with an Andalite. Axe takes the Nothlit in and clearly respects the group a little bit more for having endured this sacrifice so soon in the fight and not letting it deter them. Cassie tells Axe that he can live on the farm with her, at least temporarily, and Axe acquires the DNA of each of the Animorphs, combining them before morphing a hybrid of all of them. A strangely attractive, dainty-looking human boy who is going to be the source of some excellent comic relief going forward. Later, Cassie revisits the gardens and swims with the dolphins, and the book is over. So there we have it. The message. A pretty straightforward plot without too many twists or turns, but it gets the job done, and more importantly, it introduces Axe to the group in what I think was a pretty satisfying way. Let us rate it. I am giving the message a 5 for plot. This book can basically be summarized as Axe joins the group, and no major plot points will be missed. It follows the standard Animorphs formula with a problem that presents itself early in the book, and then a scoping out mission, and then the mission itself with something going wrong in the mission and them having to fight their way or think their way out of a bad situation. This is how almost all of these books go. But in this case, the scoping out mission was pretty uneventful and not super exciting, and the mission itself, while cool, was very quick and pretty straightforward. I can think of a few other Animorphs books that do deep sea exploration in a way that's a lot more exciting to read. For significance to the overall plot of the series, I am giving this book a 10. You can't get more significant than Axe joining the group, and honestly, I found the ethical revelations that Cassie had in this book to be a great setup for her coming growth, not to mention the amount of time that it spends on other characters and their journeys. With that in mind, I'm also giving this book a 9 for character development. We get a deeper understanding of Cassie in this book that I think we'll be referring back to a lot as we watch her progress. And I'm giving this book an 8 for writing quality because KA wrote it and it does the job. This leaves us with a final score of 7.85, and it puts this book in 3rd place of the 4 that we've reviewed so far, with the visitor ranking below it. There's not a ton to say that I haven't already. This book is definitely significant, and I thoroughly enjoyed the character analysis and seeds of conflict to come that were planted, as well as the sort of ethical seeds that were planted for Cassie's ultimate character growth, but on the whole, it's just not as exciting as most of the Animorphs books were. I am glad that Axe is here, and I'm really looking forward to him in future books. All right, my baby is definitely awake now. Perfect timing. Thank you guys so much for watching. It really means the world that you watch these. Now that I have the new computer, my editing process should be a lot quicker and a lot less painful. I frankly would procrastinate about editing because it was so unpleasant on my MacBook Air from like 8 years ago. So hopefully these videos should be coming out more frequently, but maybe they won't. Who knows? Thank you for sticking with it. I really appreciate you all.